Okay, so I think we can begin. If there's people coming in, I hope so. So I will get started. Welcome everyone to our event, a side event to the UNECE Regional Forum. We will be discussing today the multi-level acceleration for the SDGs in the UNECE region. My name is Maya, and I will be moderating today together with Melanie, and we'll be going through our short little program here today. So, today we will talk about insights from practice and research on the global, national, and local implementation of the SDGs and among a broad range of actors and stakeholders. And we have a really cool panel today that has different views on these things from different perspectives, national, global, and local. But before we get to our panel discussion, we will first have a short presentation on the main findings of the SDG impact assessment. And this is a big study that was conducted, came out last year on the political impact of the SDGs. Then we'll move to our panel discussion. And finally, we also have space for questions from the audience. And you should see a little button that says Q&A in the top right corner of your Teams surrounding. And there you can put your questions, and we will try to get to as many of them as we have time for. And so before we give the floor to our presenter, I first wanted to introduce the entire panel to you, because we have today a really cool panel, I think, with a lot of different insights. So we have, maybe I should stop sharing. Now you can actually see them, maybe. That's probably better. And the show. All right, so we have today, we have Professor Dr. Frank Bierman, who is a professor of global sustainability governance at Utrecht University, and also the lead of the Global Goals Research Project. We also have today Sandra Pellegrom, who is the National SDG Coordinator of the Netherlands, and she coordinates many SDG activities at both the national and the local level, I believe, with a whole variety of stakeholders. And then we have Leonie Groop, who is with us today, and she is a sort of an expert on city level and the implementations of SDG 5 and 11, so really also a gender perspective to urban development. And we also have Montserrat Colofon Rosas, who is a researcher at VU Amsterdam University, and she looks at the performance of multi-stakeholder partnerships for implementation of the SDGs. So different perspectives, and before we get to our panel, I will give the floor to Frank for a presentation. So take it away, Frank.
Thank you so much. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I just have to reorganize my screen. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here. It's a pleasure discussing with all of you today the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, the political impacts that these SDGs had over the last couple of years. And I want to present, as Maya has introduced it already, the findings of the SDG Impact Assessment, which was a major study that has been conducted over the last couple of years and concluded last year. And I present briefly in 20 minutes the key findings of this assessment of the political impact of the Sustainable Development Goals. But just to start, in a sense, to introduce the topic for those of you who are listening in to our presentation today and are not that fully familiar with the SDGs. It is a set of 17 global goals that the United Nations has agreed upon in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, and they come with 169 targets. Supposedly, they're all to be achieved by 2030, so there are only 7 years to go. What's important for understanding the SDGs is they are not legally binding, so it's not a treaty like the Climate Convention or so. They're not voluntarily, but they're not legally binding for governments. And many of them are rather qualitative, so they're sometimes difficult to assess whether progress has been made. They are different from earlier goal-setting processes, and that they are integrative. They are not only for developing countries, they are for global north and global south. All countries in the world are supposed to implement the SDGs over time. and they cover, in a way, almost all activities that humans are doing. So it's quite a huge agenda. And the question that many people ask, and also us in the Global Goals project at Utrecht University and in the Task Force on Sustainable Development Goals of the Earth System Governance Project, we wanted to understand what the impacts of these goals actually have been since 2015. Will it really work that the United Nations has this huge agenda, and does it really work to get governments and local actors and international organizations to change their behavior and to implement these goals over the next couple of years? And that is an open question. There are lots of studies have been done, but I think right now in 2023 is exactly the right moment of time to do this discussion, this assessment, also this discussion among experts, but also among governments to assess whether the SDGs have been successful over the last 7 years and what needs to be done. Suppose they are not that successful so far, what needs to be done in the next 7 years to make them a major success story till 2030 when they are supposed to be achieved. And this is what we have done in the SDG Impact Assessment. It has been published by a book, I come back to this later also, which is open access. So you can just download the entire assessment free of charge at any time, in any place, wherever you are. And this SDG Impact Assessment was a joint effort by 61 authors. So they're all experts. Some of them are actually also on this call, who have together achieved this by reading jointly 3,000 scientific studies. So we looked at the internet and we downloaded 3,000 articles that have in some form discussed the SDGs, scientific articles that are dealt with a certain aspect of the SDGs according to their abstract, according to their title, according to the keywords of these articles. And then we looked at a bit more detail as 20 or about 20% of these articles that we studied in more detail. And all this together is the empirical basis of the SDG Impact Assessment. So we didn't do research ourselves. We also have research program in addition, but this was an assessment of existing publications on the Sustainable Development Goals and their political impact. And we did not look exactly at the achievement of these SDGs. Instead, we want to know whether they had any political effect on political actors such as governments or cities or United Nations organizations, but also impacts maybe on businesses, impacts maybe on civil society. And we were interested in particular in 3 different types of steering effects. We wanted to know whether the SDGs had any normative steering effects. And this is what we defined as changes in rules, in policies, in governmental programs. So we want to know whether any government or any local authority or any international organization, international treaty body has changed their legal framework, their policies, the regulatory frameworks because of the SDGs in order to implement the SDGs. Secondly, we were interested in institutional steering effects, whether any country or any local authority or any international organization has changed its institutional arrangements in some way by setting up a new ministry or setting up some new committee or setting up some new organization, some institutional change that has been implemented after 2015 because of the SDGs. This is what we also looked at. And then the maybe least demanding question we had was for discursive effects. That means we want to know whether the way how actors are talking about the world, about environmental and development policies, might have changed because of the SDGs. Is the way how we understand, how we are discussing, how we are debating, how we are negotiating global policies or local policies, has it in any way been changed because of the SDGs? So these were the 3 areas that we looked at: normative, institutional, and discursive steering effects. And we did this at 6 different domains where we had different author teams. We looked at global governance. We looked at the governance at national and local levels of policy making. We looked at the question of institutional integration and coherence, which is very central to the SDG agenda. We looked at inclusiveness. The SDGs say that nobody should be left behind, that there should be an inclusive policy agenda, and we want to know whether this has been the case, whether international and national policies have become more inclusive since 2015 because of the SDGs. And we wanted to know also to what extent the SDGs have helped to reconcile human development with the needs of the planet, planetary integrity. To what extent have issues such as climate change or biodiversity depletion or ocean pollution, has it been improved in a sense because of the SDGs? To what extent has the environmental footprint of human civilization been reduced because of the SDGs? And then we also looked at the methods. And I have one slide for each, and then I'm almost done with my presentation. So first, for global governance, we were actually not that enthusiastic looking at our findings, because our findings indicate that the actual reforms in how international organizations operate since 2015, there have not been that substantial reforms that we could identify that have been related to the SDGs. And Maya and Melanie and others will talk about this later in their presentations. We couldn't find a transformative impact of SDGs on mandates, practices, resource allocation of international organizations. And we also looked a bit on the literature. There is not that much literature, actually, but we looked at scientific studies on the high-level political forum of sustainable development. And we want to know whether this new body that has been set up, the United Nations, essentially now to help implement the SDGs, we want to know whether it has become an effective orchestrator in global governance. And also here, we were not that enthusiastic. I mean, there is, of course, some change here and there, but transformative change that really brings the world forward in a transformative manner, this was difficult to identify. At the local level, we found more evidence, and maybe Sandra and others will talk about this later. There was some evidence for domestic implementation, but quite varying, and many countries have really not done much to implement the SDGs. So there's not much change to be identified. And quite often, the institutional change, if there has been any change, at the national or local level, quite often it was just a continuation of trends that have already been there before 2015. So there is a trend, maybe a positive trend in some countries or in some local authorities, but this trend is in the direction of the SDGs, but the trend has already started before the SDGs were launched. So it's not really clear that the SDGs had any impact on this trend, this trajectory that we could identify. Funding, I'm a political scientist. We know that money is always the most important. Follow the money in understanding politics to some extent. And we couldn't find a lot of reallocation of funding because of the SDGs in any country or local authority. What we did find, and we talk about this later in the discussion, some evidence that some cities have been quite active, including the city in which our project is based, Utrecht, for example. Civil society is playing maybe a more prominent role because of the SDG in some places. So civil society sometimes uses the SDGs to hold governments, to hold local authorities accountable for what they're doing. So here, the SDGs might have had some political impact, which is a positive development. Then for the question of integration and coherence, the SDGs are 17, they have 169 targets. So the question is, how can they all really work together and form a coherent policy program? And this is very important for the SDGs, is important for sustainable development policies in general. And we want to know whether this has happened, whether there has been any change in this direction because of the SDGs. And also here, our findings did not generate too much enthusiasm among our author team, because we couldn't find that much change in a way that there's a huge new efforts in terms of integration and coherence. Maya will talk about this later when she talks about the international organization in this field. So we found some first steps, but not that there was a larger impact in a way that policies became more integration, especially not the economic, the environmental, and the social dimensions of sustainability. In terms of inclusiveness, what we found based on the studies that we looked at, there's quite a mismatch between rhetoric and action. Rhetoric means, in this case, the rhetoric from the United Nations, from the United Nations General Assembly, and from the declaration that has launched the SDGs, which is a fantastic text in a way, where they talk about no one will be left behind, and we will reconcile and heal the planet. So it's a beautiful text. In terms of justice as well, but we couldn't find that much change because of this text, in a sense, because of the SDGs. We couldn't find a lot of institutional or normative effects that really showed that the vulnerable people and the vulnerable countries, the marginalized communities, that they really have become much more central in policy making, either nationally or domestically or internationally. We found some evidence that some of the emerging economies are using their existing investment programs as a way to promote the SDGs, but there's also the question whether this is a causal effect of the SDGs or just kind of a way of greenwashing and just putting the SDG logo on policies that would have occurred anyway. Environmental planetary integrity, again, we didn't find that much change. Our team that worked on this particular issue argued that there has been not that much improvement in reducing the ecological footprint of countries and of corporations and of everybody in a sense. Planetary scale, there was always limited impact that we could identify linked to the SDGs. And there was some debate, also is some debate in the literature about the fact that some of these SDGs are actually very much pro-economic growth. I mean, economic growth is actually a target under the SDGs. So there is a certain inherent inconsistency in the SDG agenda between economic growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, the protection of biodiversity and the mitigation of climate change. So we had certain doubts whether this really have worked to bring us really forward in healing the planet as the SDGs are supposed to do from human impact. And then for method, I keep this very short. I mean, we found a variety of methods. There are quantitative and qualitative sets of methods, which are very interesting, but we also believe that there is more effort needed to really bring this all together. And certainly, I mean, this is a typical social science answer. Of course, we need more research. I mean, we need more research. For example, our work is based on existing research, and there are many countries for which there is just no data. So for many countries, there's just simply no data on the impacts of the SDGs. So these are kind of the key findings that were brought forward in a full book, which is published by Cambridge University Press, came out last year. It's open access, so you don't have to buy the book. You can just download the entire book by one click with your mouse on the Cambridge University website, or also a number of other websites. And for those who don't have that much time to read, we have also a short version which has been published by Nature Sustainability last year also. It's also open access, it's 4,000 words, very quickly to be read, and gives us an insight into this process. So we had limited political impacts. That's the main conclusion that we had in this scientific process in the SDG impact assessment. So there is maybe some change here and there, and we discuss it largely later. There's maybe especially discursive impact. And then the question is, what does it mean that people change the way how they talk about sustainable development because of the SDGs? Is a good sign? Does it mean that now, after the discursive change in the next 7 years, we will observe much more institutional normative change in implementation? Or does it mean that we just will remain at the level of talk and not move forward that much? So overall, we couldn't find much evidence that institutions are realigned, that funding has changed, that policies are becoming more stringent, or no new laws and programs have been established. And we can discuss it later a little bit in the discussion section, or my panelists, my colleagues, will talk a bit more about some of these details, because all of their research is also integrated in this SDG impact assessment. Just 2 slides, if I may, Maya, on the new frontier, because this assessment has been concluded, but that doesn't mean that we stop our work, because we believe in the SDGs. We believe that this is a very, very important program. So we want to know then if the SDGs did not have maybe that strong effect so far on what they're supposed to do, are there maybe some unintentional effects of the SDGs? So some other effect that the SDGs might have brought about that were not necessarily intended by the drafters in the United Nations General Assembly and in the negotiation committees. And here, again, we looked at these issues of policy coherence, the insignificant effects on the power relations and on financial transfer. Sorry, so we started with this core finding of our work that we couldn't find that many changes. And one thing that we thought about, and Melanie might talk about this a bit later in her intervention, that's what's very important to understand the SDGs is also the bidirectional relationship between them, the SDGs, and the target actor, which are international organizations, but also governments to some extent. And we called it the jiu-jitsu effect of the global goals. And that means jiu-jitsu, this art, this martial art from Japan in a way, that you take something that comes and then you turn it around in a bidirectional dialectic process in a way, and advance your own interest without necessarily taking the goal into account in your own action. So that means that certain organizations, they have been very influential themselves in shaping the SDGs, and now they can claim that they have achieved the SDGs, but this is just because they have written the SDGs in the first place. So in a sense, there is a certain feeling among some organizations that they're doing a great job in implementing the SDG, but the SDGs have been written by them in the first place and have been influenced by them in the first place. So actually, there's not that much direct change in organizational behavior over time. And this is what we explain by the jiu-jitsu effect, but we come back to this later in the discussion. And just my very last slide now, and to talk a bit about the role that the SDGs might have in legitimizing global policies in a way that is maybe not necessarily the most positive from the perspective of sustainability worldwide. So some of the literature we looked at on some of our own research also indicates that the SDGs have maybe a function for some actors that absolves them from further transformative action in a way that there is a need maybe for some actors in the private sector, but also in the public sector, to take drastic action to move forward with sustainability. And the SDGs help them to pretend in a way, or to give the impression, partially also to take some action, but that this is then kind of ending the story for some actors, because they can say, we do the SDGs and we implement the SDGs, but then they are free of further public scrutiny about what they are actually doing. And also it helps maybe some organizations to get away from internal critique from their customers or from their employees or for their stakeholders. So some literature points to a possibility that the SDGs also have an illusionary function, or a smokescreen function, that they create for the societies at the local level, at the national level, at the global level. They create the impression that action is being taken, that the United Nations, that countries, that companies, that local authorities, they take action, they do something about the sustainability crisis, which is having 17 goals, which are demanding, which are ambitious, that have to be implemented in a couple of years. But that this entire impression is just a smokescreen, or largely a smokescreen, that hides the fact that actually it's not going that well. And actually, there is not that much transformative action that happens. And this might then, that is also a suggestion that some authors had in these debates, might lead to a demobilization effect on those actors that are fighting for radical political change. So that those actors who are civil society actors who really are interested in pushing for transformation and pushing that we are changing the way how we behave and changing the way how governments are run and changing the way how the United Nations function, that those actors are kind of demobilized because of the smokescreen of SDG action. They're all put into the framework of the SDGs. They look at the High-Level Political Forum. They believe that SDGs are moving forward, and this takes away energy. It takes away oxygen from the political process that might have a demobilizing function. And then at the same time, it might also legitimize in action by political actors, national and global political actors. So in a time of increasing planetary emergency and planetary crisis, it might stabilize the status quo and might sideline more radical positions, because everybody believes it's all going well and everything will be fine in the end because we have the SDGs. People can say, I believe my government has adopted 17 SDGs, and because of these 17 SDGs with 169 targets, everything will be fine in the end because my prime minister has said so, because he or she has signed the SDGs. And then there's and we have one project line also in this direction, even change for some economic actors. The SDGs might even help them to expand their market share and generate new market share, especially in the global south, by saying they do this not because they want to earn money, not because they want to increase the profit, but because they want to support the SDGs. So they have been also quite interesting kind of negative impacts by the SDGs, maybe also in this particular domain. So these are all some of the ideas that have not been published yet. They're not fully worked out yet, but this is the research agenda that some of us in the Global Goals Project are now pursuing. And anybody who's interested in joining this effort, I mean, we're always very keen on discussion and debate. We have, in addition to the Global Goals Project, which is a Utrecht University-based effort, we also have a task force, which is a global effort, a task force on STEM development in the global research network called Earth System Governance Project. And this is a global effort where anybody who's interested can join our efforts and can work together with us in continuing this important work and finding out what the SDGs do or do not do and what they should do and how we can use the SDGs and this agenda to improve sustainability and to really get the transformation that we need to save our planet from the impact of us, the human species. So on that, I am concluding. More information you will find on a variety of websites, which includes globalgoalsproject.eu. And then these task forces, we are, of course, on Twitter still. I think we also are on Mastodon, I believe, not that far. And I'm looking forward also to your questions. But before, we have a number of fantastic presentations lined up here, and I'm leading over to Mai.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank, for that presentation. As said before, my name is Melanie, and I will guide you through the second part of this panel, which consists of me going into discussion with each of the panelists. And as the order for our conversations, we kind of wanted to move from the local to the global somewhat. I don't think we follow it perfectly, but at least we want to start with some insights from the local level. So I would like to invite Leonie Groep.
Yeah.
And maybe ask a question. So you have, looked at and worked with municipalities and local level actors. Maybe you can just start by sharing a bit of your experience and kind of share if you recognize the results from the SDG impact assessment at the local level as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Melanie. As you both, Maya and Yuna, have stated, I've been in the past years working, mainly in the international development context on various topics related to gender sensitive and resilient urban development, inclusive public space, and women's economic empowerment in urban areas. And I guess my experiences now, let's say these are my insights. I know that many of my colleagues and urban practitioners, they do kind of make the same findings and observations, but of course, these are my personal experiences, and I'm happy if there's any other expert urban practitioner in the panel right now in the meeting to maybe also share your experiences later on. But yeah, thinking about my work and also now listening again to Frank, there's definitely a few results that overlaps that I can see. I think Frank stated very nicely at the end that while cities and civil society can actually play a bigger role and when it comes to SDG localization, I think that's something that I also can see quite a bit. I think the municipal level is a very knowledgeable governance level, and they're very knowledgeable of ongoing local sustainability issues. And when it comes to implementing sustainability projects, that's actually relatively, they're aware of, very close to their citizens, and often the threshold between the citizens and the local municipal staff and also elected representatives is relatively low. So I noticed that there's very often like an ongoing exchange between citizens and their elected representatives, that they are just more aware of what is actually, what actually is bothering the voters and the citizens. I can definitely say these things, also, let's say, competences and capacities that the local level have. That's way easier to also implement sustainability projects in countries that are rather decentralized. Because I've been working in different contexts, and we're now in the economic in the European region, but also especially in the MENA region that I've been working. I think the more centralized the country is that I've been working with, it was way more difficult to actually implement any sustainability initiatives. So I think that's a very, the more competences the local actors receive, the easier it's definitely to pursue the sustainability actions or the development projects that we're actually aiming for. However, even let's say, for example, in my work, I think you stated earlier, I'm working on SDG 5 and SDG 11. I still have to say we're I think the SDGs, they come up very, very rarely in my work. So let's say, for example, I'm working on gender equal cities. I would not necessarily say that there's a lot of municipal actors also, when it's not about specific SDG projects, that there's actually a lot of municipal actors really aware that the Agenda 2030 is out there somewhere, and especially also citizens. So, I mean, there's really a lot going on, but very often, but it's just like, hey, they have like a project on resilient infrastructure, on gender equal public space, on any other biodiversity matter. But very often what I see, it's not that necessarily, it's also somehow linked to the SDGs. And also what Frank said earlier, that I think many cities have already been somehow in the sustainability transformation process before the Agenda 2030 came out. So many of them had already sort of set priorities, and the emergence of the SDGs did not necessarily change that. And I think it's still also what I, for example, found like in my research that I did in German municipalities, that on SDG strategy development, for many these SDGs are still somehow a flow, like a construct, like an abstract construct, somehow still very intangible, floating somewhere around them. And this also really showed me again the need of, in order to really get the SDGs going also on the ground, really this process of SDG localization, and having like a dedicated person in any municipality who really says, okay, the SDGs are now my topic. Like first, as Sandra is in the Netherlands, this is like really something that can push the SDGs so much forward. But still, like many municipalities are just not that far. I think funding is a big issue. I think that was also one of the big findings of the impact assessment. It's just so many municipalities are just heavily underfunded, and there's just no capacities, no time, so no money for men to actually push the SDGs forward. These are maybe a few points, and also when Frank now was saying civil society can play an important role, and I very much agree. And I also see like that many sustainability projects, whether they're now related to the SDGs or actually not, are being put forward or are being implemented like in a participatory way. I think that's a very important thing, and that's also something that actually the SDGs, like with the having like a specific goal on this, but also the Agenda 2030 of really aiming to be implemented in a participatory way, this has actually like pushed this forward. However, I think it was also a finding of the impact assessment is something that I can also see. It's very often still a very exclusive participatory process. So you always very often first find the same actors, the same civil society actors in the process, and rarely or barely those people who you actually maybe would like to include in the process, that maybe not that much being heard. So this this of course somehow hampers a bit like the implementation of the SDGs. Another point, though, what I, for example, was also just being mentioned by Frank, like reallocating of funding, especially in the development context. I don't know how many people are right now, like in the meeting, who may be working in this, or how many people of us have already or have been requested funding or like written a project proposal for like a development project. I think it's very interesting because definitely I cannot say like by heart how much like governments are like have changed like their budgets on, or like have like reallocated funding to now implementing the SDGs. But what I can definitely see like in project proposals, usually there's always like you have to make like references to how you are actually contributing with your project to the SDGs. So governments and donors and are behind this. So you somehow have to justify to which extent are you now contributing to which SDG. But I've also been rarely, let's say me personally, in contact with actually projects that were specifically on SDG implementation. So it's more often like the way I feel like it's more often that often countries or have like just budget earmarked for gender equality or biodiversity or climate resilience, and not that much now, okay, SDG, whatever, 13. So I think while all these SDGs can actually be a really good handbook to promote sustainability actions, like on the local level, in my experience, it's, what I have been working, my experience is just like the role is by now, until now, relatively small, even though there's actually really great potential.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very interesting observation, I think. So whereas the SDG impact assessment overall found that it was mainly a discursive use for the SDGs, you actually, in your experience at the local level, say it's the other way around. So maybe there is work going on policies that might relate to the SDGs, but they're not being used as much. And at the same time, you also say that funding is very difficult to obtain, so progress might also not be as smooth as we might want. So in that context, do you think that municipalities or local actors do have the space to, as you suggested, come up with one specific person who is kind of responsible for the SDGs? Have you seen examples of this?
I did. It was mainly actually in my research on German municipalities, that actually there were like people specifically appointed, okay, you're now the person that tries to push forward like a local SDG strategy. And that's like what you're now focusing on the next 2 years. And I think what I also learned there in this research is like that this has been really very much appreciated by all. It was I looked into participatory processes, and I think like everybody really highlighted the important role of such a person, who's just motivated and dedicated to, like on the municipal level, like kind of who pushes the other colleague or who takes the other colleagues with them on board, but also who kind of ensures that the project doesn't like fall asleep halfway through. I think if one of these big issues like lack of funding for SDG localization is being addressed, I think this could have like a great value.
Yeah, I think we're just only scratching the surface with this topic, but of course we have the Q&A here after. So I now want to move on to our second panelist, which is focused on acceleration through partnerships. So Montserrat, maybe I can ask you a first question. So during the previous set of goals that we had, the Millennium Development Goals, there's been research on partnerships, and it actually turned out that many of the partnerships that had been, kind of put into the UN database weren't operational. They weren't really doing anything. So that led to kind of a fear about the potential for partnerships to contribute to actual outcomes. So what are your observations thus far for the partnerships for the SDGs? Could you elaborate a bit?
Yes, Hello, everyone. Okay, if I may, I would like to start by first, obviously, thanking the members of the Global Goals Project for the invitation to participate in this event and share perspectives on SDG acceleration from the angle of partnerships, indeed. If I may, I decided I would start with a very short presentation to contextualize our work, and after that, I'll jump to the first question you've asked me. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I hope that goes smoothly. Can you see these?
Yes, great.
Perfect. So I'm going to jump to the next one. Yes. So I am, as was briefly mentioned before, currently doing my PhD within the Transformative Partnerships 2030 project, which is a Formas-funded international research project that has been running for 2 years now. And it involves the Stockholm University, the Lund University, and us here at the Institute for Environmental Studies in Amsterdam. And this project is not the first research project studying partnerships for sustainable development. Actually, about 10 years ago, Frank, who's here with us, was part of another large project studying the partnerships that emerged from the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. And back then, they didn't find much evidence supporting partnerships as an effective implementation mechanism, as you also briefly pointed out, Melanie. So why then is the perspective on partnerships still relevant, and what's new this time, let's say? So the starting point of our project is the recognition that the 2030 agenda, like the preceding sustainable development agendas, again ascribes a key implementation role to multi-stakeholder partnerships to meet the SDGs by actually dedicating a full goal to partnerships for the goals and setting some expectations that multi-stakeholder partnerships will perform functions such as mobilizing and sharing resources in the form of knowledge, expertise, technology, and financial support. Now, at the same time, in multiple instances, the 2030 agenda recognizes that the SDGs, including the means of implementation, are universal, indivisible, and interlinked. And this is repeated over and over. Also, one of your chapters in the assessment, Frank, it's focusing in these interlinkages. And well, this is actually the point where we see potential for acceleration through partnerships. We suggest that transnational multi-stakeholder partnerships have the potential to operate in a way that connects goals and could be the space in which synergies are generated and trade-offs are managed, thus accelerating these urgently needed sustainability transformations. So in order to empirically investigate how this potential actually manifests, we started by building a data set of transnational partnerships that work on 2 or more SDGs. And now that we have the data, we're starting with the analysis, but we can already share some preliminary findings and trends that we've observed. So now, like, I finally come to answer the question. I think for that, I will show you, this is, let's say, the UN database of nowadays. It's called the Partnership Platform, and it's managed by the UNECE. And this platform has close to 7,000 entries of initiatives, voluntary commitments, partnerships, and other types of implementations. And the UN actively encourages anyone behind this type of initiatives to register here. And from this universe of entries, we had to sort out the ones that fit a formal, let's say, academic definition and some other characteristics to research that to ensure that they're researchable. So in this sorting out exercise, first of all, we found a significant number of duplicate entries in the platform. Then many of them didn't provide a website, making them difficult to research. Or their work was focused on a single SDG, which leaves them out of the scope of our project since we're interested in these interlinkages, right? And so in the end, we end up with this a bit, let's say, shocking, but not so shocking, maybe for Frank, who they also came up with a similar number 10 years ago of entries, where we are really confident to say those show they really show the characteristics of a transnational multi-stakeholder partnerships, and are or have been active. So basically they were active and then until they formally concluded their activities, but they were active. And so we think the potential to enable transformative change is here, since their work does address multiple SDGs simultaneously. Now, whether that potential is realized or not is the research that we're currently working on, but this already shows the scope we're talking about. It's just a few hundred observations, and also worth pointing out is that some of those have been active, but again, they already concluded their activity, so they're no longer currently active. So just to wrap up, we're not claiming that these are all the transnational MSPs or multi-stakeholder partnerships that exist, but it does give an idea of the proportion of activities, let's say in the UN radar, to put it somehow, where we see potential to bring about transformations.
Yeah, so thank you for quickly kind of contextualizing this. So I'm wondering, if you just looked at SDGs that might have an active website but aren't addressing more than one SDG, how many would you then be left with? Do you know?
So that do have a website
but might not address more than one SDG.
Yeah, so here, I mean, you see the numbers here. Basically, first we remove the duplicates, and then we remove the ones without websites, and then we remove the ones that are only addressing one SDG. So this box here of 2,452 entries are the ones basically that we went through one by one, all of them, and then there we checked, okay, let's see from those which ones can we really categorize as multi-stakeholder partnerships. So there may be a few more in outside that box that are really on a formal definition a multi-stakeholder partnership, but just not focusing on the two or more SDGs simultaneously. And for that, I will invite you later on to check out our technical report that we wrote on this data set and show you. Because that obviously disaggregates all the numbers more clearly.
Yeah, so you have kind of done this mapping, but can you also say anything just yet about the impact of the SDGs on partnership formation, or is it kind of too soon to tell?
Yeah, I can show another slide for that. Because we have the data of the year that partnerships have self-reported as their start year and their end years. There's a lot of missing data, but from those reporting, if we look at these, first of all, I just want to say there's this gray and orange bars. That's only because we differentiate between high and low institutionalized partnerships, but without paying too much attention to that yet. It's still just like looking at the bigger trends. If we look at this, we see that, as we know, the 2030 agenda was launched in 2015. And the 2 years after that, there's an increase in the number of partnerships being launched. However, we should not jump to the conclusion that this increase is merely due to the 2030 agenda, because let's remember that the same year, 2015, there was the COP21. In 2017, for example, there was a UN, the UN Ocean Conference took place. And in terms of partnership formation, I think it's really safer to conclude that it is large, often UN-led sustainability conferences that result in new partnerships being formed. This should not come as a surprise, since creating partnerships and registering them on this or other similar types of platforms is actually encouraged in these types of events. But While we do see a peak of partnerships reporting 2030 as their end year, actually, I think what's more interesting is that close to 75% of those reporting their end year give a year that is before 2023, so now, which of course raises questions about longevity. And so, well, all that being said, the SDGs, I think they have offered a common language to all these actors and stakeholders. And we see both in their descriptions and in their websites frequent references and structuring of their work around 2030 agenda and the 17 SDGs and their targets. But I think this is very similar to what Leonie was just mentioning, right? That a lot of these or the findings of the assessment, that it may indeed be a lot of narrative.
Well, thank you very much. It's extremely fascinating findings thus far. Hopefully we can discuss a bit more in a bit. So from the level of partnerships, I would like to move to an example of national level acceleration and invite the Dutch SDG coordinator Sandra Pellegrom. So maybe just to start with, so we had this assessment, and one of the findings was about the discursive use of the SDGs. So how would you say the Netherlands has tried to move beyond the discursive use of the SDGs? Is this something that you actively observe, strive for? What is your experience with that?
It's difficult to dive into that without having a sense of what we actually do, I think, in the Netherlands. Where to start? I think what's interesting is that, I mean, obviously you have both. You have discursive and you have genuine, and you have some institutional and you have some normative. You have all of it. And even within different sectors, you have all of it. I think one of the strengths in the Netherlands of our SDG implementation is that it's very much bottom up. This is because even before the goals were adopted, there was already a small coalition of businesses, NGOs, and several influential personalities that were involved in the international negotiations, had provided inputs, and were so enthusiastic that they already established a platform, the SDG Charter of the Netherlands, which has grown over the past 7 years to 8-9 years, because they started in 2013 already. And it has grown to a very big platform organization with more than 1,350 member organizations, many of which are the big umbrella organizations of all sectors: business, education and knowledge, the civil society, youth organizations. We have the National Human Rights Institute involved as well. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of work, very much bottom up happening. What I see there, I'm just comparing it to what the others have, other panelists have just said. In business, I think it's a very mixed bag. We are just finishing our national report that we send to Parliament every year, so it's still in draft, but I've seen all the results. And from the business sector, for instance, what we get back is that the SDGs are very well known. Over 90% of organizations, actually this is organizations broader than just business, but most businesses know them. Only about 15% have really integrated them really into the, the depth of their organization. So what you see is that there's a lot of interest to work more on sustainability. Over half of companies are saying that they need to and they want to work more on sustainability in the coming years. Part of that also due to upcoming regulation from the EU. But the challenge is to really integrate it into the core of your business, and companies recognize that. And I think therefore that I do not take such a bleak view, maybe Frank, as you put forward about the SDGs being like an excuse, maybe. I think many standards on sustainability or even human rights are not always applied as they should be by different organizations or governments. That does not make them less important as a standard to have. So even though not all businesses are using them as deeply integrated as they should probably be using them, it still is a very valuable framework. And you see that many companies are slowly, starting to make that switch. Also, thanks to legislation on corporate social responsibility that's coming up, responsible business conduct. But to do that responsible business conduct, companies often do come back to the SDGs because it is, I think, the most logical and widely shared, most complete sustainability standard that is out there. Now, in terms of municipalities, I'm actually more optimistic. We have about 1/3 of all Dutch municipalities that in one way or another have embraced the SDGs, including the 4 biggest cities. Some of them have done that more in a communication tool, discursive way, if you want, or as a partnership tool to work with business and education institutions in the municipal context. But increasingly, we see that municipal governments, local councils, and local officials are starting to use the SDGs to address all these interconnected, difficult challenges that they're facing, and that all come together at a local level, and then they start to look at some kind of a compass that will help them deal with all these complex challenges that interlink the challenges in the environment and the climate action, linked to difficulties in the social situation, increasing poverty in some municipalities, people that do not feel that they that they're invited to participate, that they can share in the well-being. So I see a lot of municipalities actually actively trying to see how they can work with that. One thing that from the government side, I think that we've done quite well is that we've managed to link the SDGs to the policy issues that are actually on the political agenda. I agree with Frank that, the SDGs as such have not landed on the political agenda everywhere equally. And I think that's also because they are framed in a way that as individual citizens, we completely understand them, we feel them, we see them. And that's why so many people and organizations are enthusiastic. But if you want to translate them to policies, they seem rather disjointed, even though, of course, it's a very connected and interconnected agenda. So I think what we've done is to really connect the SDGs to the integrated challenges, the transition challenges that the Netherlands is facing in 2 ways. In the monitoring of where we are, we have an integrated monitor of well-being and the SDGs. So the SDGs have been connected to the well-being economy, basically, or we call it the wider prosperity or shared prosperity in the Netherlands. And in our national report and in our report to the UN last year, we have connected the SDGs to the 6 major societal challenges or transformation challenges, if you want, which we have loosely based on the advice of the Global Sustainable Development Report of the UN. And that really helps to translate the SDGs to the concrete political challenges of the here and now. But the added value is in the fact that the SDGs show how that is a systems approach that is needed, how these goals are interconnected. And what we really took from the dialogues that we had to draw up our report around these 6 challenges is that it's so valuable to put people from different organizations, but also from different but adjacent thematic sectors together in such a dialogue. One of them was a bit of an experiment, but we had a dialogue about human well-being, more of like the individual well-being. How do you promote that? And we connected it to a healthy environment, the cities and the communities where people live. Are they safe? Are they climate adapted? Do people actually feel that they have a good connection to each other, but also connection to work, for instance, mobility? Are they able to access an adequate housing? And then we connected it also to, okay, and can people, well-being is also about being able to continue to develop yourself, education, constant training. And we mixed that into one dialogue and one discussion about improving human well-being. And then you get such valuable insights. And when you look at these 6 transitions in connection to each other, we saw trends coming out of the discussion about all of them. And that really gave us a very good sense of, why is it so difficult to achieve the SDGs? And that might be your next question or not?
Well, I guess what I find interesting about your story is that you also seem to have some things that might be considered by other governments trying to further the SDGs. So you mentioned these 6 kind of acceleration lines, but you also mentioned, having a good bottom-up movement. Would there be like any other points that you think could be taken away from the Dutch example in this case?
Well, one thing I'm very proud of, and it's also because it was launched yesterday. We have introduced a new policy compass, and I think it's I don't know if some of you know the Better Regulation Toolkit of the EU, which is also a very valuable tool to make better regulation. We have now introduced a similar type of compass, a policy compass in the Netherlands, really improving the way we make policies from now on. It will be the new standard. And the added value is really in encouraging a much more integrated policy making, in which we have used the themes that the government has defined for well-being and the SDGs. We've combined them into a set of check questions that officials need to walk through when they design new policies, which will really help them in any policy they design to have a very wide look at all the different effects and consequences that policies might have, but not just look at them, but also try and see whether you can find avoid trade-offs and find possible synergies. And in particular, what's interesting is that we've introduced also the requirement not to just look at effects in the here and now, in the present, but also to look at the effects potentially in the future on later generations. And we already had an assessment that was obligatory but not very well applied, but it's now much more integrated into the policy compass to assess your policies against the effects on developing countries. So the dimension of elsewhere. So what I really like about the compass is that it really requires a wide testing of all new policies against all these different SDG themes and well-being themes, but it also requires testing the present against people elsewhere in the world and against future generations. And it requires a very solid looking at the what's the word in English? The division, who profits, who doesn't, and where do you see people that are structurally left behind in many of these dimensions. That's all in the compass. I think our challenge going forward is to really help officials to actually apply it within the situation where you're often, of course, under pressure for lack of time and political pressure and so on and so forth.
Yeah, great. Hopefully we can hear some more about this later, but for the sake of time, I would like to invite actually one of my co-moderators, Maya, to share with us some insights about international organizations and a bit of the global level actors maybe. So Maya, you work as part of the Global Goals Project, and you've looked at international organizations and the SDGs. So what do we see any effects of the SDGs at the global level with these organizations?
A little bit. That's the main answer. I find it really interesting to hear all these different perspectives, because I think some of them relate quite well to the international level and others don't. So I've mainly looked at at global level international organizations, both that are sort of very universal in membership, so UN agencies, but also more regional international organizations. And one effect that I found through my studies is that since the SDGs, we're seeing more and more sort of policy domain-based silos coming up. And so rather than the SDGs being sort of an overarching framework, they might serve quite well as domain-specific goals. So an energy goal and a poverty goal and a climate goal, but not really yet as a fully integrated set. And I'm sort of, when I hear the other panelists speaking, I kind of recognize this story because Montserrat, for example, mentioned there's quite few partnerships that address 2 or more SDGs. And as Sandra was just saying, like we're now starting with these policy compass, but I mean, of course, I'm not studying the future, so that wasn't there yet in the data set that I studied. So it could be that this is just something that needs more time, but for now, it seems more policy domain oriented, and there is more sort of collaboration within those domains. And it's a little bit hard to tell what the long-term effect of that will be at this point, because it's not necessarily bad to have like more structure and an overarching goal within a specific policy domain. But the intention of the SDGs was, of course, to sort of integrate, right? And this challenge is an integration. And so there we're seeing that the SDGs as such are not having that intended effect. And how that turns out, we'll have to sort of wait and see in the future. So that is, yeah, I guess one of the main effects, and recognizing that also now at the national and partnerships level is quite interesting.
Yeah, so, you know, based on what you have discovered thus far and also connecting it a bit to the others, what would you recommend to kind of further the acceleration of the SDGs at the international level? Do you have any ideas? Of course, you mentioned focusing on more than one SDG at the same time.
Yeah, I mean that is maybe a little bit the holy grail of SDG implementation. But this is also very difficult, and we do hear stories of international organizations as well, and now also at the national level of stakeholders really trying to sort of look at all these goals and how is one policy affecting another. But it really takes time and a lot of commitment and a lot of resources and knowledge and etc. And so, yeah, the advice would of course be to try and work towards that as much as possible. But similar to what was previously stated about the impact assessment, we also see that the international organizations that were most involved in creating these goals, that they're also sort of most active in taking on these integrated approaches. So they are quite committed to this. But the ones that weren't as involved, they're not maybe as into and working with the SDGs as the others. And so the question becomes then maybe how to better involve the rest, you know, as with the businesses at the national level, can you sort of expand these SDGs that they're not only known, but that they're also being more and more used to really get to the core of whether it's business or policy. So that would be my my main steps forward. Oh yeah, yes. And actually, now it's my turn to ask Melanie a short questions, because actually Melanie did some research on UNECE itself, where we're at the regional forum of today. So that is also very interesting from that perspective. So then I have 2 questions for you, Melanie, and I'll give them at once, and then you can answer them. So one is, of course, you studied the role of UNECE in supporting the SDGs, and what did you observe? So some general insights. And then the other one would, of course, be what's the next step? What can increase the role of UNECE in implementing the SDGs?
Yeah, so basically in our study, we looked at the regional commissions for the entire globe, so all 5 that exist. And what we found is that they really wanted to make a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So during the Millennium Development Goals, the regional level hadn't really had a clear task. And before the SDGs were agreed upon, the regional commissions together wrote a pamphlet in which they asked to be given a good role as kind of the link between global and local level. So that's kind of one thing. They really wanted to contribute. And we looked at their key, you know, the key functions that they fulfill. So they deliver policy advice, they can do capacity building, and they contribute also a lot to data collection and such. And what we found is that, and this is also true for the UNECE region, is that it seems as though the SDGs have somewhat, and this is part of a trend that we've seen for a longer period of time, extended what UNECE is focusing on. So it was initially erected very much as, of course, an economic commission. And now we see that it's increasingly also really taking on board these environmental dimensions of development. This had been happening before the SDGs, but they, of course, continued this trend. And the same is true to some extent for the social dimension of sustainable development, although this, I think, is the one that the UNECE region focuses on the least. But of course, this also partially might be related to the division of labor between organizations. But overall, I think one finding is that the role of the regional commissions is extending a bit. And also, what we found is that the SDGs have been integrated to some extent into a number of initiatives that the regional commission undertook. So, for example, they have now come up with a new standard that they released last year, which is called People First Public-Private Partnership. So basically, this is a new format for public-private partnerships, really supposed to focus on integrating the SDGs into these partnerships. But in some other existing instruments, so like environmental impact assessments or some other examples, you also see that now there is, for those reporting, a demand to explain how they relate to the SDGs. And I think one thing that could be improved here is that it seems as though these reporting requirements are quite general. So basically it is described to which SDGs your initiatives contribute without necessarily, going into as much detail as the actual targets or the concrete indicators. And this, I think, can be tightened up a little bit and really have a sense of how do you say it, accountability for the SDGs in these instruments. But also, I think another interesting thing to look at is that in the UNECE region, at the moment, there's actually still a lot of data on the Sustainable Development Goals that is not being collected. So out of the 169 targets that the SDGs have, only 150 of them have a goal that we can actually measure progress on or have enough data to take them into account. So that's a really big issue because then we can't even know if we're on track or not. So that's also something that the regional commissions themselves have a role to play in, and I think should play as well. And if you look at the report for the UNECE region that was published for this conference, it actually shows that for a lot of the targets we're off track in this region. So of the 115 that could be measured, we're on track for 21. So 79 are actually in need of acceleration and 15 show a reverse trend. So basically, they're moving backwards, so to say. And I think it's interesting if you look at what the targets are that are reversing. I think there are some of the ones that would actually be extremely important in actually coming to sustainable development as a concept. So, and also some of the key conditions that would allow countries to realize the SDGs. So to give you some examples of the targets that are being having a reverse trend at the moment, they are climate change policies, biodiversity loss, macroeconomic stability, effective institutions, the ability of countries to collect taxes and other revenues, and also one is capacity building for the SDGs itself, the target. So I think I do agree with the other panelists that focusing on the connection between SDGs is important and might accelerate, but I could also imagine that it might be very valuable to look at these SDGs where we're reversing And these are concrete targets, of course, not the entire goal, but really focus on those goals that are most left behind, so to say, and see how you can connect them to other goals in a way that really might reverse the trend that we're seeing at the moment. So that's kind of what I would add on the topic.
Excellent, thank you. So we have now heard from everyone a little bit, and I wanted to move to audience questions. And the idea was here is that I would read them out, and then Melanie can point out the speaker who can comment on that. So I can keep an eye on the chat and the questions, because there's a lot happening on one screen. So Melanie, I'll give you the question. It's a question from Susanne Sule, and it's very much in line with our discussion just now on targets going backwards. And she asks, has Russia's war in Ukraine been posing more difficulties in relation to the implementation of the SDGs? So how is the war in Ukraine affecting SDG implementation?
Yeah, maybe I can move this question to Sandra Pellegrom. Would you like to share your experiences from the Dutch context?
Sorry, what was the specific question again?
So I think the question was, to what extent you notice that the war in Ukraine impacts your efforts in the Netherlands to further the implementation of the SDGs?
It's a complicated question because it has so many different effects, and I think that applies to all countries worldwide. We have, of course, seen that globally, the fallout basically has been quite negative on many countries. In the Netherlands, I mean, obviously there has been quite an energy poverty rise among many people, but government, because we have solid systems, has been able to really step in. On a positive note, perhaps, and it's always risky to say something positive when we do have to recognize that this is a really daunting crisis. But on a positive note, we see that many companies and households have been able to speed up their energy efficiency, and there has been also a spur, of course, in investment in renewables due to the energy crisis. What I like is the fact that not just the Netherlands, but many countries also at the European level have looked at how can you increase energy efficiency and the move towards renewables, while at the same time supporting households and small businesses in continuing to have access to affordable basic needs such as energy. And I think there's interesting models that sort of combine that. What I really like is that, in fact, we are taking models here that have already been around in many developing countries for a very long time. I used to live in South Africa, and like in many other countries, there's a system there where there's a limited basic use of, for instance, drinking water, clean water, is available for a very low price for everyone. And then beyond the basic use, the price goes up because, of course, there's a big water shortage in South Africa. So these kind of systems, I think, never waste a good crisis. Crises help us think out of the box and help us look at these kind of solutions that really try to combine these different interests, even though at the initial, limited way that we usually think they seem like trade-offs, while they can actually be mutually supporting. And I think that is exactly what the SDGs require. And even if you don't call it an SDG policy, in fact, it is.
Yeah, I think maybe a short comment from my side for the UNECE region. So the war in Ukraine is specifically mentioned as one of multiple crises that are kind of contributing to this reversal on some of these targets. But yeah, it's of course complicated because some effects of the pandemic are also still kind of reverberating and combined with the effects of the war that we're experiencing. So you can't really filter out exactly all the effects, I guess.
Well, I have to say that in my perspective, but I'm again, I don't want to sort of deny the situation we're in and the crisis we're in, but I do think that all these connecting crises are bringing us to a point where we're increasingly starting to recognize the need for integrated policies and transformative policies. And that, of course, I think, you know, one of the challenges with the SDGs has been that we've tried to achieve the SDGs from just a regular siloed perspective. And that leads to a lot of stickering, and it leads to not recognizing the depth that is in many of the SDGs. And it leads to not recognizing the fact that we can only achieve the SDGs if we move to a systems approach. And if we do sort of look at transformative long-term policies, we're starting to see that much more now. And that recognition, I think, well, I hesitate the word thanks to, but due to these crises that we're in. So I do think that seeing this so up close, these different crises, is helping us to move to a more SDG-based way of policymaking, even if we don't always call it explicitly an SDG-based policymaking.
Okay, next audience question. I have a question from Landre Rotimi, and it is directed at Frank. They say that your presentation confirms that we're not on track to achieve the goals by 2030. I think we all know that, unfortunately, by now. And so the question is a bit about how can we adopt new priorities and directions to achieve the goals? And there's a specific timeline here for 2033 to 2035. Maybe, Frank, you can also reflect on whether that is a realistic timeline, and perhaps what priorities we can set or think about new goals or different goals after 2030. So I'm expanding the question a bit.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Andrew, for the question. A very, very important question, of course, because I agree also, of course, with Sandra that there has been quite a bit of change in Netherlands. It's just that our assessment is based on existing literature, in the sense it goes to 2019, in particular 2020. So many of the changes that Sandra has reported in particular are not in our assessment yet, because they're too recent, and also a little bit maybe also too prospective into the future, in the sense. So we need more studies to study these kind of effects. But talking about the question about the long-term goal, in a sense, and what to do better, I fully agree with Sandra's other points that this transformation is absolutely needed. And ideas we had in our team is, number one is, you have seen yesterday, or was it today, this court action. I mean, that, for example, United Nations General Assembly has asked to review from the International Court of Justice the legality of climate change policies, human rights impact, etc., etc. So this is all because it is based on law. The SDGs are not legally binding. So one point is that maybe some of these elements could be in a stronger legal framework, in a way. Not necessarily that we need to have a treaty for all the SDGs, of course, it's probably unrealistic, but to have a move away from voluntary standards into the direction of having more legally binding standards. Which will also be related to another point that we discuss in our term, is to strengthen maybe the institutional framework for some of these SDGs. For example, they are very weakly institutionalized internationally. There's only this high-level political forum. Also nationally, I must say, also in the Netherlands, despite what has been done, it's not that we have a standing committee in parliament or something like that. I mean, so it's not what you could expect, in a sense. So there is change, is there, the monitor, etc. But it's not that every Monday morning Parliament discusses the SDGs. I mean, it's not like that. Or I haven't seen the Dutch Prime Minister speaking a lot about transformative change into the SDG direction. So this level of change is not there. And this could be considered, I mean, to have a stronger institutional change. And you see what I find personally quite interesting, a range of new, smaller treaties that are being discussed and being advanced. For example, the discussion about having a treaty on fossil fuels, non-proliferation of fossil fuels, or on coal. There are some of these initiatives which I find quite interesting, to really just have a simple argument say, let's ban coal by 2030 or 2035. And that is also a goal, but it's a stronger goal. It's much more radical than what the SDGs are saying. And it comes with the proposal to turn this into an international treaty. And I think that is a way forward, that you increase the legal power of these goals and that you also make these goals more radical. So I would kind of call for a discussion by civil society and governments, maybe also to some extent, or political actors, to have a process by looking at these SDGs and trying to find what can become more radical and more transformative. Number one, what can be institutionalized in a stronger way? Number two. And number three, what can be turned into a more legally binding force? Because we have really, I'm much more convinced about legal action after I've seen all these court actions. And turning to the Netherlands, and then I stop also. So the Netherlands have been sued by the NGOs. It's kind of widely known in the Uganda case. And the funny part from political science perspective is that it has an effect. It's not, I mean, so in a sense, an NGO has sued the Dutch government, and the Dutch government takes it seriously to some extent. And this is really, it shows that legal action and legal treaties and agreements have a potential to change politics in national, especially in countries where the rule of law has a certain standing and a certain respect. So countries also, Germany, also to some American states, they're really, India also, for example, they're really, governments are changing policies because they lost cases in court. I think that's a fascinating development. And the SDGs should be in that trajectory. And I close on that. And then one point for the Ukraine war, one point is, I mean, of course, there's lots of negative part. I mean, like the attention to the army, everybody's buying tanks and investing and building up and all kind of negative problems. The positive part, the Dutch emissions went down, carbon dioxide went down by 9%. And I believe that is there will be not a strong rebound effect. We had a rebound like after COVID, everything went down, like air transportation went down, now it jumps back. And I believe that the change we have now in the last year on saving energy will be more permanent. So after, suppose the war is over at some point, I don't believe that we have a rebound effect, that everything goes back before the Ukraine war. So I think a lot of the emission reductions we have achieved because of the crisis will be stable and permanent, I believe. I'm not 100%, but a lot of them, I guess. Anyway, so radicalization, institutionalization, legalization, that's what I would advise.
Very clear, thank you. I have a question again from Landre Rotimi, specifically for Montserrat. And if I summarize the question, it is, what can we do about the design and delivery of multi-stakeholder partnerships to make them perhaps contribute more to the SDG or more effectively?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I must say it's too early for our research to give very specific recommendations about how partnerships can be formed to deliver on transformations. But there's one thing I will say, and maybe for that, I want to share my screen again because I have a nice figure to show. Let's see. I hope this goes quickly. So I hope you can see that. Okay. So as we see in this figure, there are some SDGs that are addressed together by partnerships more often than others. So this is what we see from the partnerships perspective, right? So the pairs of SDGs that are most commonly addressed together are within the climate biodiversity nexus, namely SDGs 13 on climate action, 14 on life below water, and 15 on life on land. Those, let's say pairs of SDGs are on the top of our most frequently addressed together SDGs, let's say ranking, if we could call it somehow. And they're connected in all their possible combinations. The other pair that is making it to the top is SDG 3 on good health and well-being, together with Goal 4 on quality education. But meanwhile, and somewhat worryingly, SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and especially SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, are the overall least connected through partnerships, of course, but the least connected goals to any other goals So one preliminary takeaway from us is that there's room for improvement in terms of bridging the different issue areas of sustainable development. We believe that if this is done consciously, as Sandra was saying, and with the intention of taking a systemic, more like nexus approach to SDGs, synergies are more likely to emerge, bringing about transformative change. And yeah, so the specifics of whether and how that happens are the outcomes of our project in the months and years to come. So keep in touch. But this is, I think, what I can share at this point.
Great, thanks. There was another question that was for the entire panel, so perhaps I can then take Melanie's role and give it to Leonie first, because you haven't been speaking again. So the question is basically about, it's from, I can't find it, but it's from Prajal Pradhan. Yes, there it is. It is about the post-2030 agenda, and will there be a next generation of SDGs? If so, how to prepare it?
Well, I think preparations could already start. I guess maybe even like this, like the summit coming up in September could already be a start. Since it's now the agenda 2030 has been being prepared quite extensively. So I think we could already start preparing for anything that's happening after 2030. Yeah, I think like just like a broad collaborative process, engaging really different actors, based on like also an honest review of like how the Agenda 2030 has been implemented, is needed in order to actually think further, like without having probably evaluated what we've been doing the last 7 years and what's going to happen the next 7 years. I think, well, also after 2030, it'll be a rather pessimist outlook otherwise. And then just money, I would say money, pumping money, funding projects, funding ideas, and really trying to understand what has been what has happened, what has not happened. And I think very much also what Frank has been saying, to also actually commit to something. I think that would be my takes on this question.
Could I come in on that? And this is not, this is my personal opinion based on conversations, not a government position. I think I would look at this in three steps maybe. I think first of all and foremost, and that is really what the SDG Summit this year is about, is to accelerate and retake the SDG agenda because of all the problems we've seen over the past years. We really need to put in extra effort to achieve these goals. They're not achieved. We're seeing stagnation, reversal. So taking back the SDG agenda, putting it back on track, I think is the first and foremost thing we need to do. And that is also probably why the SDG Summit will not be the place that people have a lot of attention for beyond 2030, which I think is correct. And I think financing is a major issue indeed. Second, very good point to learn from what have we experienced. And I think one thing we've learned is that this is still in 2030, these goals will not go away. They'll be probably even more relevant than ever, but we've realized that it's not so easy to achieve them. They're not the MDGs with, quite clear-cut investments in certain countries and you will be able to make progress. This is really about changing a lot of the things that, a lot of the way we do things. And it's really quite much more fundamental than we maybe even realized when we set them up. I still think it's a very strong, extremely relevant agenda, very well built. So I think you don't want to lose that even beyond 2030 because it's still relevant. And we're now starting to understand what needs to be done. So let's not, throw away all this knowledge and what's been built up, but let's build again on that. And then third, very good idea to look at where we can, review certain existing goals and build on knowledge that we've gained. And I think, Frank mentioned SDG 8 I think it's an interesting one because, I mean, there's a lot in there already about decoupling, for instance, about green and inclusive growth. But that's an interesting one, and I wonder where we will be in that discussion in 7 years' time. But there's many of these areas where you can look at, where can we further strengthen the goals. But in my mind, we should really also value what we have and try to really build on that. But first, accelerate and make this decade of action happen for the present SDGs.
Montserrat or Frank, did either of you want to contribute to the post-2030 question?
Well, I may have a short comment here. I think if I remember correctly, somewhere in the assessment, you may correct me if I'm wrong, Frank. There's this maybe hypothesis that well, the change has not been observed because first it needs to be it's like the starting phase, and then like the results come on a later stage, right? So that may be maybe some hopeful like we could keep the hope that will be the case, so that we will in the second phase of the implementation of SDGs, that's when we will start seeing more of the results, so hopefully. That being said, I think if we start thinking about like post SDGs and what should come then, etc., I do think that there's room for maybe focusing much more on really these like shared causes between, we see a lot of different symptoms, but what are the shared causes behind those different symptoms? And not just jump to conclusions of like, okay, there's this symptom over here, there's a problem, and then let's solve that. But more like, okay, everything that we want to solve are actually symptoms of something that's behind. And what is that? And so I think if we talked about that in much more explicit terms of distinguishing between causes and symptoms, I think we would greatly benefit from that.
Well, I can just add, I mean, what Montserrat hinted at was we had a long debate about it's always the glass half full, half empty. That's a long debate, of course. I mean, we had the pessimist in our group and said, oh, this is just a discursive change. Nothing is really happening in national or local or international politics. And then we had the optimist in a way who said, well, there is a discursive change and this is positive science, a great development, because after discursive change, you will have institutional change and a normative change, and then money will be reallocated and the world becomes a better place. And this is a debate we had in our 61 author team all the time, and there's no solution because the solution the answer can only be given in the future. I mean, that's the point in science. So in 2030, we will know whether the optimist or the pessimist were right, and then we can maybe have some bets on it. So anyway, but I fully agree. I mean, what is needed is now not a discussion on having new goals, but just implementing the ones that are there. And that's clear, that's what should be done. So they are not being achieved right now. And they are ambitious, and we need to just move forward and try to find ways to achieve them. Once we know what hasn't worked, and since quite a few of them will not work, then of course the next debate, I don't foresee a debate on a new set of goals because they are quite well designed as such. I mean, will be a discussion on the targets, I guess. No? And then, as I said, I believe that we need to have a more radical agenda. We have a huge planetary emergency. If you look at the climate debate, for example, and that we probably in 10 years will overshoot the 1.5 target in a sense. So they're totally new discussions, and I think we need to have a much more transformative or much more radical discussion on many of the changes, like SDG 12, for example. We have some research also on that, which is not published yet, therefore I'm not talking about it too much. And the point is very much there's not much happening. I mean, this is kind of sustainable consumption. That is what we need. This is a change where especially the countries in the global north have to engage in a way of just reducing the unsustainable degrees of consumption and production that is happening in these countries. And that needs to be done. And that is a radicalization of SDG 12 that is not happening yet. And I think this is a debate that the planet, everybody has to lead at some point. And that is not really captured under SDG targets. So I could imagine that there will be a debate on having much stronger agreements on much more transformative change, especially in the over-consuming countries in the north, including the Netherlands. but the election results are pointing into a different direction, actually. Anyways, it's kind of a bit difficult, but
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry.
So we after our panel, there's the UNECE closing plenary. So to kind of, you know, be kind to the people who might have to go there in some capacity, I now want to ask at least one closing question to all of our panelists. So the question is actually, this forum is, of course, organized in a run-up to the SDG Summit coming up in September and the HLPF. So what are you hoping to gain from this session that is coming up at the global level for yourself or in general? Or what part of it are you most looking forward to? So maybe I can just start with Leonie.
Yeah, I guess my answer won't differ that much from what I was just saying. I think it is it can be a really it's a good point in time to have this summit right now and to actually review what we have been achieving the last 7 years. And also, I think what Montserrat was just saying, I think it's a really nice approach to actually properly understand the causes and its implication and understand what has worked and what hasn't and why. And then based on this, also Sandra was saying, really just commit for the last 7 years to this, to the SDGs that we have, and yeah, commit to them and trying to have proper, yeah, trying to implement them so that we reach the goal, all those, most of the goals as far as we can still make it. And I think, yeah, that's just like this honest review, and also, I mean, consultations for the SDG Summit are already ongoing, but I think it's also very important that different voices are being heard during the summit. And I think that's also something I'm looking very much forward to actually, yeah, hear from voices that are maybe also usually not being heard, and that I have a chance to actually also other people also have the chances to actually explain and lay out how they have been experiencing SDG implementation in the last 7 years, and what yeah, they wish for.
All right, Montserrat, what are you looking forward to or following this this summit?
Yes. So from my research perspective, I'm very curious about what this midpoint will mean for partnerships. Of course, we've heard here and there that there may be like a new campaign situation to push for more partnerships, etc. I think from our project perspective, for us, it would be important to get across the message that more may be better, but not enough. So it's not that it comes automatically with just, okay, more partnerships. But personally, I think while it's sometimes easy to get a bit cynical and you know, say like, okay, well, we're anyway not going to achieve them or whatever, I think we should kind of reconnect with the fact that the SDGs may really be like the make it or break it point. So we should not like take them for granted. They're already really good. They have great potential, and it took a lot of effort to reach this point of having the SDGs. And that may not come again for several reasons, not only geopolitical reasons, but also just like the fact that the situation is deteriorating, right? So we may not have the chance again. So I do think I would hope personally to see a more serious commitment coming out of a real worry that this may be the time. And no second chances.
Yeah, so maybe going to Sandra, I was wondering, because I also heard that the EU is now making a VNR, so voluntary national review. Is this something that you think will have a great impact as well? Maybe you could also share a bit of your reflection on that.
I think it's really important because it shows the commitment of the EU to the SDGs. And I think what is really valuable that the VR of the EU will definitely link all the existing policies of the present Commission to the SDGs. So it will very clearly show that all the EU is doing is really geared towards the SDGs. So I think that is it's a very good thing to do. I think I already mentioned the better regulation toolkit of the EU. I mean, that really is connected to the SDGs, and that helps to make EU policies more SDG proof. Somebody asked about new commitments. I'm not sure. Usually in VNRs, there's not always a commitment. I think I don't want to say anything about new EU commitments or anything, but I'm not sure whether the VR is the place to do that. So don't be too disappointed. As regards the SDG Summit, I would really hope that North and South can come together and, you know, in all the crises and the differences of opinion that we've had, recognize that we need to join hands to really push the SDG agenda forward, because it's in both of our interests. And I really think this is also what the SDG Summit will do. I can see that many countries are really feeling that way and really want to work together to see, okay, how can we accelerate and take these SDGs back on track again? One thing that I personally and also from the Netherlands hope is that the Declaration on Future Generations that is scheduled to be adopted, hopefully at the, you know, just before the SDG Summit, that will also create hope that, you know, we are going to be able to be more future-proof in our policy making, and that being more future-proof is also something that will improve the SDGs in the here and now. Those two things are interconnected. So that would be my hope.
Great. Well, maybe last but not least, Frank, what are you gonna focus on for the upcoming summit? You are muted, I think.
Just agree with some of what I really expect or hope for is action. I mean, in a sense, what we do is we are scientists. We are political scientists, social scientists, so we are not politicians. We don't have opinions. We just assess what is there. And what our team has done, we have read 3,000 academic articles that have measured the impact of the SDGs. And the finding is half full, half empty, whatever it is, but the finding is the impact is pretty marginal in many constituents, many countries, many local places. There is, of course, some evidence for change at the city level, as Leonie also mentioned. And here and there, there's also more recent evidence, as Sandra pointed out, that is not covered in our study yet, because it's a meta-analysis, so therefore it's always a little bit behind time in a way, because we only looked at published research. But our finding is not positive. So what we hope for is that governments will realize, and other actors, of course, not only governments, but especially in the UN context, governments will realize that the SDGs are not being achieved and that they have not changed their institution, they have not changed a normative framework sufficiently. And so therefore, the political impact, the transformation that was promised in 2015 and partially in 2012, this huge, fantastic language of the UNGA decision of the Agenda 2030, it has not been implemented. It's just largely on paper. It has not been implemented. So I would hope, as a citizen, that governments, and very much at the global level, as Sandra has pointed out, global North and global South are getting together and really move forward, because many trends are negative, especially on the climate and biodiversity and some others, and the transformative change is needed. For example, there was a debate again about deep seabed mining, for example, and that we need to have deep seabed mining to finance all our electric cars. That's kind of not the way forward, in a sense, to shift one problem from climate to go to electric cars, and from electric cars go to deep seabed mining and mess up the entire ocean system. And that is, again, SDG 12. Maybe having mass mobility with electric cars is maybe not the right way forward. We have to reconsider the way how we live and how we consume and how we run our society, especially in the global North. And I hope that action will be happening at the summit in that direction. That's what I hope. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone who participated today and who, was willing to share their ideas and thoughts on this topic. I mean, this is, of course, just the start of the conversation and not the end of it. So I hope we'll remain in contact. So for those who are interested in the assessment, of course, you can go to globalgoalsproject.eu and find more information. And there we will hopefully also post a bit of a reflection on this panel and our ideas on continuing the discussion. And for now, I wish everyone a great closing plenary and good luck with all their activities in trying to accelerate the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you for sharing. Thank you for bringing this all together. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks Alex for moderating.
Bye bye, everybody.